Hello everyone and welcome to this group 1. We have now 1 hour time to practice with the components, and you are in the group for financial analysis. So you will build one component for finance. And I will give you a quick introduction. Shouldn't take longer than 5 to 10 minutes. Then it's your time to solve the exercises, and in 1 hour exactly, 6:45, German time, we will all collect back to Paula, and he will end the session altogether. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We are in the group 1. You will have exercises for building a component for financial analysis. And as helpers today, you have Lada, a data scientist at KNIME. Then
Hello.
we have Felix. Felix is our business analyst at KNIME. Is it correct?
Junior, yes.
And then I'm Maarit, also a data scientist at KNIME, and we are all authors of the financial analysis components at KNIME. Then I see we also have Anna here, and she's also in the components team. Hi, Anna. And to get started, you will need to download exercises either from the KNIME Hub or from the Dropbox folder. We can post the links in the chat if you want. And when you import these workflows to your KNIME Explorer, then you will see this workflow group 1 financial analysis, and there the workflow where you solve the exercises, and also the solution workflow where you can check your results at the end, or if you need help at some point, and you can also take help from there. Okay, a bit of context to the tasks that we are doing today. So we have these verified components, and they are organized in categories. And one of these categories is financial analysis. And there we have components, for example, for transforming asset prices to returns, and also components for handling and visualizing, analyzing revenues from contracts data. And also in this category is the component that you are going to build today. So your task is to create a component that analyzes the ARR, annually recurring revenue. Before you come to the actual task, building the component, you need to complete 2 steps, which are accessing the data and pre-processing the data. So in your workflow, which we have prepared for you, the exercises workflow, you access raw data that contains contracts. For each contract, we have an ID, then we have the value of the contract, and also the period when the contract starts and when it ends. And this kind of data could come now from, for example, if you sign up to a fitness studio and you pay for a certain period. This could also be software licenses, or they could be any other services where you pay for a certain time. Okay, now we need to transform this data into recurring values so that it looks like this. So each row in the original table, we transform into recurring values. What does it mean? We calculate all the months within the time range, so from the start month to the end month. In this case, we have a contract period of 1 year. So we have then at the end in the transform table, we have 12 months. Then what happens to the value column? The value of the contract is 30K in this case, but it's split now to the months within the contract period. So split by or divided by 2 in this case. As you can see, this operation, for that we already have one verified component. So it's this calculate recurring values. At this point, we now have the revenue value by month and by ID in the output table. And what comes next to calculate the ARR is then your task, which is here. So at the end of this session, you will have a component called Analyze ARR, and it has an interactive view where you can see the ARR extracted and visualized based on the data. So you can see how is the ARR developing in total, from within each year in the data, and also you can search for the ARR value in a specific month. What are the steps? How do you proceed to come with this result? So you will have the exercise workflow. When you open it, you see this template. You first need to just execute the workflow inside these yellow boxes, which complete the steps 1 and 2, accessing the raw data and transforming the contracts data into the recurring values. And then you start here building the steps to come with the component analyze ARR. So these steps are first to create the workflow for the functionality. There is a lot of ETL tasks, aggregating, visualizing mostly. Now we have the functionality and we want to have the interactive view. So we need to create a component of the workflow or put the workflow inside a component. And then we have all the visualizations in one composite view. This is step 2. In the step 3, we start preparing the component for reusing and sharing. So we create configuration options so that it works for different kinds of data with new other column names than we had here in our example. Step 4 is where we use the breakpoint node. What if a user gives an empty table, for example? Step 5, we fine-tune the component with a description with an icon. And step 6 is we check, is the component working? No, step 5 is still, after fine-tuning, we share the component. And in step 6, we then use the shared component from the KNIME Hub space that we have. And this is for you, the introduction. So you can now start building the workflow. I will post the links where you get the exercises in the chat. If you need any help, please use the chat here in this room. Yes, I see there is already one question. Okay, it's from Anna. Hi, Anna. Yes. So please post your questions here in the chat. And I would say after the first 15 minutes, we have again a short interaction session. I show you the solution to the step 1. This step 1 takes the most time because it's really building the workflow. Then I give you again a little break and show you the solution to the step 2 and 3 and so on. And if you want to solve the exercises at your own pace, it's no problem to ask a question to the step 5, although I haven't shown the solution to that yet. So with that, I say have fun with building the component and please ask if anything is unclear.
I see there's a question in the chat. Why we multiply by 12 in the first part and we do it in the second part. You can already see, well, I think Maarit sharing her screen, right? That the first view is about the full ARR, but in the second part we pivot and we look at the different years. So it's a different calculation, and thus to have the ARR, we multiply it by 12 again. It's also, you see, we take for the second part also from the original data from the component, just so we need to apply the times 12 again.
Okay, at this point, I show you the solution to the first step and then give you another 10 minutes for these steps and then again 10 minutes. Okay, so here you see the step 1. I hope you all found your way inside this meta node and could follow the instructions here for the part 1 and part 2. And they both calculate and visualize the ARR just in a bit different ways, as you will then see in the interactive view. So this part 1 starts by calculating the recurring revenue values for each month instead of each month an ID as we currently have it in the data. So if you check the output of this calculate recurring values, you see we have the recurring months going here in the date and time column, and then the values here and for each customer ID. But the same month appears for this one ID Anton, and then it's also here for another ID Horst. So we don't yet have the recurring values by month, and this is how we start the workflow with the group by node. And here the grouping column is the date and time, so that we only have one value by month per month at the end. And this value is the sum of the recurring values by customer for each month. Okay, we click OK. And now you see we have a data where we have the months running from the first month in the data to the last month in the data. And for each one, we have a value. And these are now actually the monthly recurring values. This is also something sometimes reported as a financial KPIs. But since we are now interested in the annually recurring revenue, we multiply each value by 12. This is what we do with the math formula or math formula multi-column node. And depending on which you select, you either select the column itself, this one, or if you have this multi-column, you select this current column and multiply it by 12. And you remember to replace, because we are, in this case, we only want to have the ARR values. Okay. And the only thing that changes in the output table is that these values have now changed. Now, next, we want to visualize the data. So we take this line plot Plotly, which builds nice line plots. Here, the essential configurations are to define the x-axis column. What are the values running on the x-axis? So these are the recurring months. Secondly, what is the numeric column on the y-axis, and it's these ARR values, and this is already enough of configuration. If you want, you can, for example, add the title or something else, like you now as advanced KNIME users. Okay, and how is this line plot looking? And you see, okay, for this company, at least the business is doing quite well because the ARR is increasing month by month. This table view uses exactly the same data, just that it shows the values, the recurring values month by month in an interactive table. Here, the essential configuration is to define which values are shown in the table, and we want to show the months as well as the recurring values, so we select both columns here. Okay, and the interactive table looks like this one, and here we could now search, for example, only 1 year, like 2017, and see the records for that. Okay. And this second part of this exercise was to create a pivot table and visualize the columns in the pivot table in a line plot. We want to pivot by the month and by year, and we need to extract these from the timestamps of the recurring values. So we need to start with this extract date and time fields node, and here we select year and month number. If you selected this month name, it's of course also okay. I normally prefer this number option because it's easier to sort as it's supposed to be sorted from 1 to 12. Okay, and if you now check the output table, you see we have now, besides the timestamps, the recurring values and the IDs, we have now also the additional information in separate columns of the year and month. And these columns we now use to pivot the table. We want to have for each month a row. So this is then our group column. We want to have for each year a column. So this is our pivot column. And in the manual aggregation, we again sum the values, the recurring values. Okay. We have now a pivot table. And now we want to multiply each value in each column by 12, so that we come from the monthly recurring revenue values to annually recurring revenue values. This is exactly the same configuration as before, but this time we have the same expression that we apply to multiple columns. And finally, here in the line plotly nodes, we select all the columns because every year is supposed to show in a separate line. And this time the x-axis column is the month from 1 to 12 for each year. And when we then visualize this one, we see now how the ARR is developing for each year. For example, we see here in the first year in our data, 2015, the direction was quite nice. It was first at the low level, then increasing towards the end of the year. Whereas, for example, 2018, the direction was the opposite. And this is where I leave you again to solve the next tasks, which starts by selecting all the nodes. You can also select the components, the annotations if you want, and create a component of this. And I will let you again solve the tasks 2 and 3, and then in about 10 minutes, I'll be back and show the solutions. Okay, so 10 minutes have passed again, and I will show you again the solution to the steps 2 and 3. So the step 2 was passed, and which means you were supposed to select these nodes in the workflow that was given to you in the solution or inside the meta node. Select the nodes and say create component. Then you give the component a name like analyze ARR. Click OK, and now all the workflow should disappear inside this component. Okay, now we have the component, and I switch now to the meta node where you were creating it. So if you want to check, we are now in this path. We are here at step 2. We have now this component, and what you wanted to do, I will answer the question, or someone of my helpers answers the question in the chat. You want to lay out the interactive view. So this is what you get as a result. This is what I preferred, so that the 2 line plots are next to each other. If you prefer it other way, you can do it. And how you do this, let me show you. You go inside the component. So you either right click, say component open, or a faster way is to press the control button and double click. Okay. Now you see this visual layout editor button activates as soon as you are inside a component. And here you see in this visual layout tab all the elements that you have in your component. And if you want, for example, have all the elements on top of each other, you can just drag one more row here and then drag the one of the elements into it. And now there is one empty column, and you can remove it by this button here. Or if you want to have one column, you can also add it by this plus button. Okay. This was the step 2. This was the fast one. And the next step was then to use the configuration options. So why do we need the configuration options? If you now copy and paste this component, you are sure it's not going to work for some new data because it doesn't have anything to configure. You can try it here. So here I have the same component from the previous step. Just to be clear, what we are now here in this step 3, create configuration options. Okay, and I have here the same component that you created in the previous step. And here I have now data with new column names, so that every column name now has a prefix, new. Okay, and I try to execute this component on this data. What happens? Okay, it fails. But this could be possible And this is what we do here in this step. So we add the configuration options. And if you now go inside the component and follow the instructions, you will soon see it works. So what are the required steps? We want to have a configuration options. What are the columns that are used to execute these tasks? The two columns that we need are one date and time or date column for the recurring dates, recurring months, and one numeric columns for the recurring revenue values. And that's why we need two column selection configuration nodes, which you could find here in the workflow abstraction category and then configuration. And here are also the widgets, which was also the question in the chat. Okay, then you have here the options in the column selection configuration nodes. What is the label of the configuration option that is shown in the components configuration dialog? Then you can show a description to this exact option, like you have for all nodes, the description of the configuration options. Then you have the flow variable name, because later you're going to use this selection as a flow variable to override the settings here in these nodes. This is a column selection, and what columns are shown you to select from can be limited by the type here. So I want that the recurring dates column can only be selected from the date or date and time columns in the input data. And that's why I have only enabled these options here. And then I select the default value. Okay. And the same here in these recurring values. I again give the configuration option label, its explanation or description, the flow variable name, and this time I limit the columns shown in the drop-down menu to numeric columns. I use these merge variables to be able to use these flow variables in both branches. Okay. Next, I want to override some of these settings by the flow variable name. So currently, the name of my column for the recurring values, it's date and time. And you see it here in the flow variable output of the node. So it's recurring date is the flow variable name, and its current value is the date and time. Now I want to override the settings here in the group by node by this date and time. So first of all, this group column, I want to override by the flow variable coming out from here. And this aggregation column, I want to override by the flow variable coming out from here. I do this in the flow variables tab. Group by columns, I have selected to override by the recurring date column, aggregation columns by the recurring revenue column. And I have a couple of other nodes where I need to override it as well. So here in the line plot, I have the x-axis column, which I need to override by the, again, by the recurring months or recurring dates. So I have done it here. As you can see, you can I think you lost me. Just a second.
We can see your Slack now.
I know. Yeah, I lost my second monitor, but now you see my, not my Slack anymore.
Now we can see your platform again.
Okay, perfect. So I was by overwriting the here, and the other places to override by flow variables was here, extract date and time fields. Here you need to override this column, again by a flow variable, recurring date. And the last place is then in the pivoting node to override by a flow variable. So these group and pivot columns, they are standard because they are the granularities, but the aggregation column name, this value, it's overwritten by a flow variable, which I find from here. Okay, now we check again if we can use this component with data that has new columns. So we copy the component that we have now configured and use it now to this new data, which has the prefixes in the column names. So I select here the new date and time as the recurring date column and this value column as the recurring value column. And if I now click execute and open views, you see it works. So now this was the first step to make this component into something that can be shared and reused by multiple data. And again, let's continue. You will have the break, or you will have the time again to solve this on your own. So this time you will control now the error messages in the component, and we have only 10 minutes left. But I would leave these 3 last steps for you now to solve, and I would say in 7 minutes I will show you the solution to the last 3 steps. Okay, and we have 5 more minutes to finish the tasks in this group until we are returned back to the main room with Paula, and I can show you now the last steps in this exercise. Okay, so we are again here, and the first task is to check that the component fails if the input is weird and the error message is meaningful. So we go here, and you can see here is now the component with the configuration options that we created. And if we now try to execute it, I can reset it with an empty table. So you see here the input table, the columns are proper, but the table is empty. What happens if we execute this node? It fails, but it says something went wrong with the line plot node. If we try the same with data where the recurring revenue values is missing, the component is most probably going to fail as well. But let's see what is the error message there. So it says, okay, the column selection configuration node failed. But to make sure that the user of the component understands what actually fails, even if the user doesn't know what is inside the component, we need to create the proper error messages with the breakpoint node. And I will show you it here, how we do that. So as the instructions say, we start with one breakpoint node that checks if the input table is empty. And this is very straightforward because in the configuration option, you need to check breakpoint enabled. And if it's empty, you can just enable this option. And the third thing to do is to check this custom message option and say what you want to say as in the error message. And in this case, the input table is empty. The execution failed. Next, we want to also stop the execution if there are too few columns in the data. So there are less than 2 columns. For that, we use this option in the breakpoint node, which is stop the execution if a flow variable matches a value. And the error message is this time, the input table must contain at least 2 columns. Okay, how do we create such a flow variable that checks if there are less than 2 columns? This is what happens here. So we have this extract table dimension, and this outputs as a table the number of rows and columns, and also as flow variables the same. Now we check with this rule engine variable if this number of columns is lower than 2, which is here. And if it's lower than 2, the flow variable created by this node called check columns has the value stop. And this stop is the condition that we use in the breakpoint node here. And here you now see this breakpoint nodes is used before any data are passed to the nodes that are actually supposed to execute in the component. And this way we make sure that the component immediately stops the execution if it's anyway going to fail somewhere later. This was the step, and we had 2 more steps left. And one was this add description and share. So what you do, I go back to the previous step so that I can demonstrate it. if you have a component here and you go inside it, and now you are in the component and you see there this pen icon, and you click on it and you can write a description, you can add the background color, you can add an image, and also name the ports. When you have done that, you share the component like I have done here, and you share it by component and share. And here you can select then a space on the KNIME Hub. Now it says we are going to be returned it to the main room in 30 seconds. So I stop at this point. How you then use your share component, this one I need to leave for you. But I thank you very much for joining. And if you have any questions, please contact us via the other channels, via email, via LinkedIn, or any way